Hey guys, what's up? It's Kirsty. Today I'm here to talk with you about The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This is going to be a non-spoilery part of the review, and then I will let you know when I start getting into spoilers. What an interesting book. This is about an immigrant named Jurgis Rudkos who arrives in Chicago with his family, his new wife, a bunch of kids, an old woman, just, an immigrant family here to improve their lives. They show up and everything goes wrong from the very beginning. They are subject to the whims and wiles of unfettered capitalism, the corruption of the meatpacking industry, and the politics and everything else that affected working class immigrants in Chicago during this time. The story is quite grim and it has a pretty negative view of America, but overall I think it made America a much stronger place because it inspired some reforms of the meatpacking industry. It's a really important book. I'd say it's kind of similar to Atlas Shrugged, except it's the socialist version of the political novel. Just the opposite perspective, which I enjoyed because I've never read anything like it. We see the meatpacking industry up close and personal, and it's really disgusting, and it made me want to become a vegetarian. That's what this novel is mostly known for, and that is the kind of reform it caused. But he was aiming for reform politically about more than just the meatpacking industry when he wrote this book. He was aiming for reform of how immigrants were treated as well, and how working class people were treated. Unfortunately, those reforms, they just didn't really happen, and I think definitely some of them were important. I'm not a socialist, but he pointed out some things that needed changing. They didn't get changed for a very long time. Thankfully, America is a much better place in that regard, and I feel like we've all been lifted out of the kind of poverty that he's talking about in this book. I think every country had phases where they went through stuff like that. If that sounds interesting to you at all, I definitely would recommend checking it out. One person on Facebook, when I was talking about this book, said it's her favorite book ever and she's read it like 4 times. She really, really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad I read it. I don't know if I would say I enjoyed it, but I thought it was extremely interesting. In the beginning, I was extremely emotionally involved in the story. As it went on, it just got more interesting. It just changed. It changes as the book goes on, but I would say definitely worth a read if you're into politics and early American history, if you kind of want to know what might have been going on during that time. If you do any research around this, that can be helpful too. I think Sinclair is a trustworthy journalist, but you always have to do your own research to check this stuff out. And this also, by the way, is the uncensored edition of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. If you read The Jungle in school, or if you've read it before, you probably read the censored edition, which was the edition that publishers were okay with publishing back then, because when Upton Sinclair went to Chicago to research this initially, he stayed for 7 weeks and he lived like a worker and he saw what they saw and he talked to them. He wanted to include all of that. The publisher had paid him to basically do an expose muckraker type novel of the meatpacking industry. He gave them that, but he also gave them a socialist manifesto, essentially. The book does get very propagandic, particularly near the end. I have not read the censored edition. This is the uncensored. Like I said, this was his original novel that he wrote. It was not published until 1988, which is almost a century later. It was republished and then it went out of print again, and then this publisher, C Sharp Press, they republished this fully 1/3 longer than the one that you read in school. And the kinds of things that they cut out of this book were stuff like names and titles because it wasn't mainstream enough. There was also explanation of how capitalism may have influenced the immigrants in any vices they developed, such as alcoholism and prostitution. It just makes the immigrants much more relatable, how they got into those situations. The characters also have a lot more psychological depth in this version, from what I understand. I was reading the reviews of the censored version of this, and all the reviews are like, oh, it's all about the idea and the characters have no psychology. I was really confused because I read this version and I thought that all the characters had their own personalities. Definitely the people with the biggest personalities were the socialists at the end of the book. I'd say the cast was fairly strong. The idea was definitely stronger. It's really more of an idea kind of a book, a political kind of book. And I don't want to get into any spoilers, so that's going to be the end of the non-spoilery section. If that sounds interesting, go check it out and then come back and we will discuss. Lots to discuss about this one. Alright, I'll talk to you soon. Bye! Come back! Alright, so I'm assuming that if you're here, you've already read this, or you don't mind being spoiled. What ends up happening in this book is Jurgis, the immigrant, in the first third of the book, has his family around him, and they're slowly dying from the ills of society that are all caused by capitalism and would all be solved by socialism, but we don't know that that's where he's going in the very beginning. That's not until the end. That's the first third. The second third is after his family dies, he ends up going into the criminal underworld. That was really interesting. By then, my emotions had kind of died in regard to this book. The beginning of the book, I was definitely here for the emotions. I was into the Lithuanian culture, and I really wanted them to succeed. But when Jurgis' son, Antinous, died, I was just like, okay, my emotions are done. Are you serious? Like, his wife, Ona, died. It was horrible, it was graphic, it was ugly, and then his son just, like, drowns in some mud outside their house. It was a little eye-rollingly melodramatic that Jurgis encounters all the worst luck that somebody possibly could. These things probably did happen. And some other kid was, like, eaten by rats, eaten alive by rats. Like, some of this was just like, I'm sorry, but you lost me. You know, it was just too melodramatic for me. Anytime he or his family would get a job, they'd lose it like 2 weeks later because the factory would close or something like that. After a while, it became really clear to me that Sinclair kind of hates America. It was just so relentlessly grim. And I was reading it alongside Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, which presents the concerns of the period in a much more balanced way. Even though, as I said, in this uncensored version, we do get a lot of more connection to the characters, it's still very much an idea book. It's still very much a message book. It's a muckraker novel. He's just getting his message across. When he did have to cut it in order to get it published, he cut out mostly character stuff. He did cut out some of the more graphic stuff from the meatpacking industry scenes and prostitution and stuff like that, but a lot of it was character stuff that just shows what was really important to him. Whereas Jack London, who had the same beliefs, was more interested in character-driven stories to the point where you can't tell he has a social agenda as much. Upton Sinclair was not going to be confusing people with that. He was going to give his social agenda. He was going to ram it through. That was his purpose, which is fine. It reminds me very much of Atlas Shrugged. Unfortunately, both Atlas Shrugged and The Jungle fall into the realm of melodrama when they start getting so message heavy that their characters kind of lose their spontaneity and personality and morals. There wasn't really any virtue. In Atlas Shrugged, the virtue is capitalism. In The Jungle, the virtue is entirely political. You can see that all the socialists are very much concerned with one another's well-being, and everybody else in the book is completely selfish. It's very one-sided like that, just like Atlas Shrugged is extremely one-sided. But I was very much still interested because it was easy reading in the sense that the style was very easy to get into and very accessible. So the second part, when Jurgis is becoming a criminal in the underworld, that was really interesting too, to see all of the different kinds of political grafting going on. He thought the criminal justice system was just like extremely corrupt in a crazy way. We say the criminal justice system is corrupt today, but not like this, you know, not what he was saying. I don't know if that's true or not. But it was really interesting, and I was really curious about what was going to happen with Jurgis. I definitely wasn't going to stop reading, even though my heart wasn't really in it. My head was definitely in it. By the end of the book, as I was getting to the socialist parts, where it's like really clear what this book is supposed to be preaching, that was also really interesting. I've never read anything socialist like that before. I did think a lot of the ideas were extremely pie in the sky and would never happen. For example, he said that we could all live on 1 hour of work per day because of all the things that the socialist revolution would change about our society, such as there would be no more war because everybody will just be so happy. Why war would be inconceivable. War is a huge money waster, and so we'll have a lot more money when we don't have any more war. Yeah, so there was a lot of things kind of like that it's like, yeah, right. He really laid it out in detail, all the ways that the revolution would make things better monetarily. The plot of The Jungle was basically the discovery of, the enabling of, and the fight against greedy capitalism. That is the trajectory that Jurgis goes on. So he's kind of like an everyman or like a pilgrim. You're supposed to follow along. He's like the Watson character. He has no idea what's going on, and neither do you. So you're kind of following along with him and learning as he learns. You're supposed to kind of come to the same revelation that he does in the end, which is, I am a socialist at heart, and I'm going to fight the good fight. Because all evil seems to stem from capitalism and people's response to capitalism in this book, it basically means that there is no moral arc for Jurgis. He just has an arc of experience and intelligence. Those are the things that increase over the course of the book. He gains more experience and he gains more intelligence about the movement and how to fight for it. That is his moral cause, is to fight for the movement. So there's not really a character arc in that sense. Jurgis's conversion of sorts to socialism is very, very similar to somebody's conversion to a religion. In fact, he says that Christ was the original socialist, anarchist, hated money, workers' rights kind of guy. He's like the founder of socialism, which as a Christian, I know that is not exactly correct. I thought his take on religion was really interesting, and basically he thought that socialism was the religion of the modern day. That should be what people are believing in. That should be their faith. They're looking forward to the day of the revolution, and that's going to be the salvation of everybody, essentially. If all the humanity's evil stems from capitalism, then when socialism takes over, all those evils are going to disappear, right? Yeah, sure. He says in here that Christ thinks that money is evil and it's basically the root of evil and stuff like that, but that's not exactly what the Bible says. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. Christ did have followers that were rich, and he didn't tell them all to get rid of their money. He didn't tell them all that they were going to have a hard time getting into heaven. It was just, if you're really comfortable and rich, it's hard for you to realize that you need that. So that's what Christ was talking about when he talks against riches. Christ is very much a proponent of giving to the poor and taking care of the poor and advocating for the poor. He did hang out with the prostitutes and the drunken guys and the tax collectors and the people that society hated. Those are all things that are true that Sinclair talked about. I would not say that Christ was a socialist. And I think the early church did try some socialist strategies, but the difference between their socialist strategies and what political socialism advocates is that, for one, it was voluntary, and for two, it was just the church taking care of the church. It was not the government taking everybody's money to take care of everybody else. And another problem that I have with socialism in the book is that he says that, basically all human evils come from capitalism, and that people will just be way better once the revolution has come because there will be no reason for them to be bad. But I think that's a really optimistic Rousseauian view of human nature. I don't think just having all the strain taken off of you is going to make you some really good person or something. You can be a good person whether you're poor, whether you're rich. It doesn't really matter. Hey guys, it's Editing Christy here. I just wanted to jump in and explain that I think what Sinclair is trying to say here with the morals is that poor people commit crimes out of need. That's number one. Jurgis is only in prison because of his need, basically, and the corruption of the justice system. And his friend that he meets in prison has the same problem. Number two, rich people commit crimes out of greed. And number three, if poor people are not any longer in need and rich people are controlled by the government, there will be no more crime. But unfortunately, I think that's just a little bit too optimistic. We don't want to end up with 1984 here. I mean, we have a fantastic police force now. My husband's in law enforcement, and they can't be everywhere. They can't stop everything. And it's not incorruptible, as we know. There are some out there that are just really corrupt cops. So I don't think that we can trust the government. He just thinks that the government can fix everything, basically, and I just don't think that that's true. I think human nature will wreak havoc in whatever system of government a country has, unfortunately. You can do things that help. Obviously, I think the country is a much better place today than it was then. Another interesting thing about comparing The Jungle to Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow was because The Jungle was written in the first decade of the 20th century, there's a lot of racism going on because people just weren't really as aware of the flaws in their ideas there. Ragtime was written about the same period, but it was written in the 70s, so it has a much more enlightened view of race relations. One of the main characters in Ragtime is a black man fighting for justice during this time period. The Jungle is extremely racist in a couple of areas, particularly in the way it describes African Americans. I'll read you a quote to prove it. A howling throng of 3,000 or 4,000 surged about, men and women, young white girls from the country rubbing elbows with big buck Negroes with daggers in their boots, while rows of woolly heads peered down from every window of the surrounding factories. The ancestors of these black people had been savages in Africa. Now, for the first time, they were free to gratify every passion, free to wreck themselves. They were wanted to break a strike, and when it was broken, they would be shipped away. So whiskey and women were brought in by the carload and sold to them, and hell was let loose in the yards. A little bit of racism there. It's really his collectivist views of people that lead him to stereotypes. So just as all rich capitalists are cheaters, and all socialists are incorruptible and fantastic speech makers, and all criminals are driven to their behavior by their economic surroundings, and they had no control over that. Just like all that, he generally speaks of African Americans just like he speaks of any other collective group of people, and I think that is the flaw in his thinking. But regardless of some of the flaws that I mentioned with this book, I definitely think that his journalism is trustworthy. I think that this kind of stuff was going on. How can you make up all that stuff? I don't think that you could. I'm really glad that books like this are published. I think they're important. I think they make America a better place. I think they make the world a better place. And I don't think capitalism can survive and thrive without books like this revealing when people are cheating people. I think there are a lot of authors that try to do this kind of muckraker writing these days, trying to be very political and just share their points of view. Today, we're better at the character side of things and the emotional side of things. I'm thinking of like The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which is emotionally moving. Whereas I don't think her book is as thorough as Sinclair. Like, I don't think most writers today that are trying to get their messages across are as thorough as Sinclair. He's extremely thorough, and that's something I really appreciated about this book. If you're going to write a muckraker novel, you really need to explore all your avenues and really do your research, because if you don't, people who know what's going on better than you do are going to notice. I can say that with respect to his ideas on religion and socialism, he got some things wrong, so I can't say that he did his research so well that he got nothing wrong, but this would be a good standard to aim for regardless, for anybody who's trying to point out things that are wrong with the system and make changes and just make a difference. I wish more authors would really take his example to heart. So that is all that I have for you about The Jungle. What a really interesting book. I really hope that you guys will check it out if it sounds interesting to you. And thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to talk about it with you. What's the last classic that you read that you really enjoyed? Have you read The Jungle, or have you read Atlas Shrugged, or have any other books that are like political dystopia, Brave New World, or anything like that? I would love to hear about it in the comments.